The struggle for dominance among male lions represents one of nature's most brutal and unforgiving competitive arenas. A zero-sum game where victory brings exclusive access to territory, mates, and the opportunity to pass genes to the next generation, while defeat typically means exile, injury, starvation, and death as a wandering nomad without the resources or social support needed for survival in an unforgiving landscape. This fundamental reality of lion social ecology has shaped the evolution of male lions over millions of years, producing the physical characteristics we recognize today, including massive size, powerful musculature, formidable weapons in the form of teeth and claws, and the iconic mane that serves simultaneously as protection during fights, as an intimidation display to rivals, and as an advertisement of quality to potential mates. The competition between males begins in adolescence, when young males are expelled from their birth brides, and continues throughout their lives as they fight to establish territories, defend them against challengers, and eventually face the inevitable day when age and accumulated injuries make them vulnerable to displacement by younger, stronger competitors. Within this context of relentless competition and violence, certain rules have been observed so consistently across lion populations and study sites that they have come to be understood as fundamental principles of lion behavior. Territorial males encountering each other, particularly when they are not coalition partners or relatives, but rather competitors, claiming adjacent or overlapping territories, respond with immediate and intense aggression. They do not negotiate. They do not communicate peacefully, and they certainly do not share resources like water or food that are essential for survival and that provide opportunities for ambush or assertion of dominance. The confrontations between rival males, when they occur, are spectacular displays of aggression involving roaring contests that can be heard for kilometers. Physical displays intended to intimidate and to establish which individual is larger and more formidable. And if neither male backs down, savage combat that can last from minutes to over an hour, and that frequently results in serious injury or death for one or both combatants. This understanding of how rival male lions interact makes what happened at a waterhole in the Kgalagadi Transfrontier Park, spanning the border between South Africa and Botswana, in September 2020, all the more extraordinary and inexplicable. An event witnessed by a handful of fortunate observers and captured on video that would subsequently be viewed millions of times by people struggling to reconcile what the footage showed with everything they thought they knew about lion behavior. The incident involved two of the most famous and successful male lions in the entire Kgalagadi ecosystem, individuals who had been known to researchers and to regular safari visitors for years and who had established themselves as dominant territorial males ruling over prime areas of the park that offered the best hunting, the most reliable water, and consequently the most attractive conditions for maintaining prides and successfully raising cubs. The first of these males was known as Makulu, a Setswana word meaning the Great One, or grandfather, a name that reflected both his impressive physical stature and his advanced age for a wild male lion. Makulu was estimated to be approximately 11 years old, which placed him well past the typical prime years for male lions and into the phase where physical decline begins to make territorial defense increasingly difficult and where challenges from younger males become more frequent and more likely to result in displacement. Despite his age, Makulu remained a formidable presence, a massive individual with a dark, full mane that showed some graying, particularly around his face, but that still conveyed power and experience. He had held his current territory for an impressive 5 years, an unusually long tenure that spoke to his fighting ability, his strategic intelligence in choosing when to defend aggressively and when to avoid unprofitable conflicts, and perhaps to a degree of fortune in not having faced challenges from particularly strong coalitions during his reign. His territory encompassed approximately 100 square kilometers of prime habitat, including 3 permanent waterholes that never dried even during the most severe droughts. Extensive areas of good prey habitat where gemsboks, springboks, and other species congregated in huntable numbers, and enough denning sites and cover that the pride females who shared his territory could successfully raise cubs with relatively good survival rates. Makulu had sired dozens of cubs during his 5-year reign, and his genetics were well represented in the current population of young lions throughout his section of the park. He was a documented success by every measure that mattered in evolutionary terms, and yet his very success and the prime nature of his territory ensured that he faced constant pressure from rivals who sought to claim his resources for themselves. The second male involved in the Waterhole encounter was known as Sekakama, named after a Setswana word meaning the cutter or the divider, a reference to a distinctive scar across his nose that had been inflicted during some previous battle and that created a visible line dividing his face. Sekakama was younger than Makulu, probably around 7 or 8 years old, placing him squarely in the prime years when male lions reached their peak physical capabilities and when their ambition to control territory was matched by the strength and aggression needed to seize and defend it. Sekakama had been a nomad for most of his adult life, wandering the park's vast spaces either alone or in temporary alliance with other nomadic males, surviving on opportunistic hunting and on scavenging when possible, always searching for territory he could claim, and for the stability and reproductive opportunities that came with successful territorial establishment. Over the previous year, Sekakama had been gradually expanding his range into areas that overlapped with Makulu's established territory, testing boundaries, challenging Makulu's dominance in increasingly bold ways, and clearly preparing for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation that would determine which male would control these prime resources and which would be driven out to face an uncertain future elsewhere. The two males had encountered each other several times during this period, and each meeting had followed the expected script with aggressive displays, roaring contests, and escalating tension that had several times come close to erupting into physical combat before one male, usually Makulu relying on his experience and his still formidable presence, had managed to drive Sekakama back without an actual fight. But observers familiar with both males, including rangers and researchers who monitored the park's lion population, recognized that the balance was shifting. Makulu was aging and showing subtle signs of decline in his condition and in the intensity of his territorial displays. Sekakama was gaining confidence and was increasingly willing to push confrontations further before retreating. The consensus among those who followed these lions was that a decisive battle was approaching, probably within the next few months, and that the outcome was far from certain, given Makulu's declining condition and Sekakama's prime-age strength, but that the fight when it came would be violent and would likely result in serious injury or death for whichever male lost the contest. What he didn't expect, what no one could have predicted based on normal lion behavior, was that both Makulu and Sekakama would approach the Waterhole simultaneously from different directions, would arrive at almost exactly the same time, and would find themselves confronting each other at close range in circumstances that should, by every established principle of lion territorial behavior, have resulted in immediate and violent conflict. Johannes noticed Makulu first, spotting the distinctive dark mane moving through the sparse vegetation approximately 200 meters to the north of the Waterhole, approaching with the steady, purposeful walk of a lion heading toward water with clear intention to drink. At almost the same moment, one of the guests in Johannes's vehicle pointed toward the east and asked what the other lion approaching from that direction might be. And Johannes felt his pulse quicken as he recognized Sekakama's distinctive scarred face and his characteristic gait. The two males were on a collision course, both heading toward the same waterhole from different angles. And the geometry of their approaches meant they would arrive at almost the same time, creating exactly the kind of unexpected close encounter that typically triggered explosive aggression and immediate fighting. Johannes quickly explained to his guests what they were about to witness, warned them to remain absolutely silent and still to avoid drawing the lion's attention or creating any disturbance that might influence what was about to unfold, and ensured that his camera was ready to document what he expected would be a dramatic confrontation that might escalate to actual combat if neither male was willing to retreat. Makulu reached the waterhole first, arriving at the water's edge and lowering his head to drink, his attention focused downward as he lapped at the water with his tongue, satisfying the thirst that the day's heat had created. Makulu had sired dozens of cubs during his 5-year reign, and his genetics were well represented in the current population of young lions throughout his section of the park. He was a documented success by every measure that mattered in evolutionary terms. And yet his very success and the prime nature of his territory ensured that he faced constant pressure from rivals who sought to claim his resources for themselves. The second male involved in the waterhole encounter was known as Sekakama, named after a Setswana word meaning the cutter or the divider, a reference to a distinctive scar across his nose that had been inflicted during some previous battle and that created a visible line dividing his face. Sekakama was younger than Makulu, probably around 7 or 8 years old, placing him squarely in the prime years when male lions reached their peak physical capabilities and when their ambition to control territory was matched by the strength and aggression needed to seize and defend it. Sekakama had been a nomad for most of his adult life, wandering the park's vast spaces either alone or in temporary alliance with other nomadic males, surviving on opportunistic hunting and on scavenging when possible, always searching for territory he could claim and for the stability and reproductive opportunities that came with successful territorial establishment. Over the previous year, Sekakama had been gradually expanding his range into areas that overlapped with Makulu's established territory, testing boundaries, challenging Makulu's dominance in increasingly bold ways, and clearly preparing for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation that would determine which male would control these prime resources and which would be driven out to face an uncertain future elsewhere. The two males had encountered each other several times during this period, and each meeting had followed the expected script with aggressive displays, roaring contests, and escalating tension that had several times come close to erupting into physical combat before one male, usually Makulu relying on his experience and his still formidable presence, had managed to drive Sekakama back without an actual fight. What he didn't expect, what no one could have predicted based on normal lion behavior, was that both Makulu and Sekakama would approach the waterhole simultaneously from different directions, would arrive at almost exactly the same time, and would find themselves confronting each other at close range in circumstances that should, by every established principle of lion territorial behavior, have resulted in immediate and violent conflict. Johannes noticed Makulu first, spotting the distinctive dark mane moving through the sparse vegetation approximately 200 meters to the north of the waterhole, approaching with the steady, purposeful walk of a lion heading toward water with clear intention to drink. At almost the same moment, one of the guests in Johannes's vehicle pointed toward the east and asked what the other lion approaching from that direction might be. And Johannes felt his pulse quicken as he recognized Sekakama's distinctive scarred face and his characteristic gait. The two males were on a collision course, both heading toward the same waterhole from different angles. And the geometry of their approaches meant they would arrive at almost the same time, creating exactly the kind of unexpected close encounter that typically triggered explosive aggression and immediate fighting. Johannes quickly explained to his guests what they were about to witness, warned them to remain absolutely silent and still to avoid drawing the lion's attention or creating any disturbance that might influence what was about to unfold, and ensured that his camera was ready to document what he expected would be a dramatic confrontation that might escalate to actual combat if neither male was willing to retreat. Makulu reached the waterhole first, arriving at the water's edge and lowering his head to drink, his attention focused downward as he lapped at the water with his tongue, satisfying the thirst that the day's heat had created. Eventually, Makulu finished drinking and began to move away from the waterhole, walking in the direction from which he had approached, heading back toward the core of his territory where his pride was located. Sekakama remained at the waterhole for several more minutes after Makulu's departure, continuing to drink and to rest before he too left, moving off in a different direction that took him back toward the periphery of the disputed territory. The encounter was over, resolved without violence, without submission, and without any clear assertion of dominance by either male. It was as if both lions had mutually agreed that on this particular day, in these particular circumstances, the resource of water was important enough to both of them that sharing it peacefully made more sense than fighting over it, even though such pragmatic calculation seemed far beyond what lions should be capable of according to standard models of their behavior. Johannes immediately began reviewing his footage, watching the encounter again on his camera's screen, confirming that what he thought he had witnessed had indeed occurred and had been captured in detail. He knew that this video would be of significant interest to researchers and to the broader community of people fascinated by lion behavior, and he began making plans to share it with scientists who could analyze it and potentially extract insights about lion cognition, decision-making, and social flexibility that this remarkable encounter seemed to demonstrate. Over the following days and weeks, the video was shared with lion researchers, including Dr. Philip Stander, a Namibian biologist who had spent decades studying desert-adapted lions and who had particular expertise in male lion behavior and territoriality. Dr. Stander's analysis of the footage and his subsequent discussions with other experts in lion behavior revealed just how extraordinary and unprecedented this encounter had been. He noted that in the extensive literature on lion behavior, in the thousands of hours of observation that researchers had accumulated across multiple study sites and populations, there were virtually no documented cases of rival territorial males sharing access to resources in this manner. The typical pattern when such males encountered each other, particularly during the dry season when water was limited and valuable, was immediate aggression leading either to one male retreating before combat began or to actual fighting that could be prolonged and savage. The fact that Makulu and Sekekama had managed to share the waterhole peacefully suggested several possible explanations, each of which had interesting implications for understanding lion cognition and behavior. One possibility was that both males had made some form of cost-benefit calculation, had assessed each other's condition and fighting ability during that initial tense confrontation, and had each independently concluded that the risk of serious injury or death in a fight was not worth the immediate gain of exclusive access to the waterhole, particularly since both would be able to drink adequately even while sharing the resource. This explanation required attributing relatively sophisticated assessment abilities to the lions, an ability to evaluate not just immediate circumstances, but also longer-term consequences, and to choose strategic retreat or tolerance over automatic aggressive response. Another possibility was that the repeated encounters between these two males over the previous year had created a form of familiarity or even mutual respect that modified their responses to each other, that having tested each other multiple times without decisive outcome, both males had developed a more nuanced understanding of their relationship that allowed for context-dependent responses rather than rigid adherence to territorial aggression. This explanation suggested that lion social relationships could be more flexible and learning-based than simple instinctive responses to categories like rival or coalition partner. A third possibility, which Dr. Stander found particularly intriguing, was that the extreme drought conditions and the scarcity of water might have created circumstances where normal territorial exclusion became maladaptive, where the cost of defending resources against all competitors became prohibitively high, and where temporary tolerance or even implicit cooperation in accessing critical resources became a better strategy for survival. This would suggest that lion behavior could adapt flexibly to environmental conditions, with rules that applied during times of abundance being modified or suspended during times of extreme scarcity, when survival might require compromise and flexibility rather than rigid adherence to competitive exclusion. Regardless of which explanation was most accurate, the incident clearly demonstrated that lions were capable of far more behavioral flexibility and potentially more sophisticated decision-making than simplified models of their behavior acknowledged. The encounter became a focal point for discussions about animal cognition, about the role of individual learning and experience in shaping behavior, and about the dangers of treating species-typical descriptions as absolute rules that individual animals could never violate. The video footage was featured in documentaries, analyzed in scientific papers, and shared widely on social media, where it generated millions of views and extensive commentary from people amazed to see these powerful predators apparently choosing peace over violence in a situation where violence seemed inevitable. But the story didn't end with that single encounter at the Waterhole. Over the following months, rangers and researchers monitoring both Makulu and Sekekama documented additional peaceful encounters between the two males, instances where they came into proximity at waterholes or at kill sites, and where they tolerated each other's presence rather than fighting, though they never developed what could be called a coalition or alliance, and maintained separate territories with only limited overlap. The pattern suggested that the initial Waterhole encounter had not been an isolated fluke, but rather had established a precedent or had revealed a capacity for coexistence that both males continued to employ in subsequent interactions. This ongoing peaceful coexistence was particularly remarkable, given that it contradicted the expected trajectory based on their ages and competitive relationship. Most observers had anticipated that Sekekama would eventually launch a decisive challenge against the aging Makulu, would fight him for control of the prime territory, and would either kill him or drive him out to die as a displaced nomad. But instead of this violent succession, what emerged was something unprecedented, a gradual transition where Sekekama expanded his territorial control into areas that had been Makulu's domain, but where this expansion occurred through what appeared to be tacit acceptance rather than through violent conquest, with Makulu gradually ceding portions of his territory and contracting into a smaller core area rather than fighting to the death to maintain his previous extensive holdings. By mid-2021, approximately 9 months after the initial Waterhole encounter, the territorial situation had stabilized into a new configuration where Sekekama controlled the majority of the former disputed area, including 2 of the 3 permanent waterholes, while Makulu retained control of a smaller territory centered on the 3rd waterhole and on the area where his longest-standing pride females denned. The 2 males' territories now shared a border rather than overlapping, and encounters at this border remained largely peaceful, characterized by mutual avoidance or by brief displays that reaffirmed boundaries without escalating to combat. This outcome, a peaceful if gradual transfer of territorial control from an aging male to a younger challenger, was so unusual that it merited detailed documentation and analysis by the research community. Dr. Stander collaborated with other lion experts to write a comprehensive case study examining the Makulu-Sekekama relationship, analyzing the factors that might have enabled this peaceful succession, and discussing the implications for understanding lion social flexibility and for managing lion populations in protected areas where human intervention sometimes created novel circumstances that wild lions might need to adapt to. The case study noted several factors that might have contributed to the unusual outcome. First, both males were solitary rather than being part of coalitions, which meant that confrontations were always one-on-one, without the complication of coalition dynamics where multiple males might participate in fights and where numerical superiority could determine outcomes. This parity might have made both males more cautious about engaging in all-out combat, given the significant risk of injury, even to a winner. Second, the extreme drought conditions during the period when their relationship was developing might have created unusual incentives for tolerance, as both males faced survival challenges from the scarcity of resources and might have benefited from avoiding injuries that would compromise their ability to hunt and to maintain condition during difficult environmental conditions. Third, the repeated encounters between the 2 males over an extended period might have allowed for a form of negotiation or at least mutual assessment that would not have been possible if they had been strangers meeting for the first time. Finally, individual personality variation might have played a role, with both Makulu and Sekekama perhaps possessing temperaments that made them less rigidly aggressive and more capable of flexible responses than average males might be. The case study acknowledged that personality variation in lions was still poorly understood, but that accumulating evidence from long-term studies suggested that individual lions varied considerably in traits like aggression, boldness, and flexibility. and that these personality differences could have significant effects on social outcomes and on individual success in ways that simplified models based on average behavior failed to capture. The broader implications of the Makulu-Sekikama case extended beyond just academic interest in lion behavior to practical applications in conservation and wildlife management. In many protected areas, managers faced challenges with managing lion populations, including decisions about when to intervene in conflicts between males, how to handle situations where territorial fights might result in deaths of valuable individuals, and how to maintain genetic diversity while respecting natural social processes. The demonstration that male lions could, under some circumstances, resolve competitive conflicts peacefully rather than through lethal combat suggested that interventionist management approaches might not always be necessary, and that natural processes might be more flexible and less deterministically violent than managers had assumed. People from around the world commented on how the encounter challenged their assumptions, how it demonstrated that even in nature, where survival of the fittest was supposedly the only law, individuals could make choices that prioritized survival over dominance, wisdom over aggression, and pragmatic coexistence over winner-take-all combat. The story was used in educational contexts ranging from wildlife biology courses to business school case studies on competition and cooperation, each finding relevant lessons in the remarkable moment when two rival kings faced each other at a waterhole and chose peace over war. For Johannes van der Merwe, the guide who had witnessed and documented the original encounter, the incident became a career highlight and a story he would tell countless times to new guests on subsequent safaris. He would drive them to that same waterhole, would point out the locations where Makulu and Sekikama had stood facing each other, and would share the footage and the story of what had transpired there, using it to illustrate the complexity and unpredictability of wildlife behavior, and to encourage his guests to watch carefully, to be patient, and to remain open to being surprised by animals who refused to follow the scripts that humans had written for them based on limited observation and oversimplified models. Makulu lived for another year after the waterhole encounter, maintaining his reduced territory and continuing to mate with the pride females who remained loyal to him despite his diminished domain. He eventually died of natural causes in late 2022, found by rangers who had tracked him for years and who mourned the passing of a lion who had lived longer and more successfully than most wild males ever achieved. Sekikama continued to thrive, establishing himself firmly as the dominant male in the territory he had gained, siring numerous cubs and proving himself to be a successful territorial male in his own right. The question posed at the beginning of this story was what happened when two rival kings met at the waterhole, and the answer, documented through careful observation and preserved in remarkable video footage, was something that defied the expected natural pattern of aggression and violence. What happened was that two lions made a choice, whether through sophisticated cost-benefit calculation or through some simpler mechanism of mutual tolerance developed through familiarity and repeated interaction, to share a critical resource rather than fighting over it, to coexist peacefully, at least temporarily, rather than engaging in potentially lethal combat, and to demonstrate that even in the supposedly rigid hierarchies and fierce competitions of the natural world, there is room for flexibility, for wisdom, for what we might call mercy. If we were describing human behavior, but what we must more carefully describe as adaptive behavioral plasticity when speaking scientifically about wild lions. The encounter remains one of the most remarkable and well-documented instances of unexpected peaceful interaction between rival male lions, a case that continues to be studied and discussed years after it occurred, a moment captured on video that serves as a permanent reminder that animals are far more complex, far more capable of surprising us, and far more worthy of our careful attention and our intellectual humility than simplified narratives about nature, red in tooth and claw, would suggest. In that moment at the waterhole, in the choice that two lions made to drink rather than fight, to live rather than risk death, to adapt rather than rigidly follow expected patterns, we see reflected something profound about the nature of life itself, about the balance between competition and cooperation, about the role of wisdom and experience in tempering aggression, and about the remarkable capacity of living beings to find ways to survive and even to thrive by writing their own rules when the old rules no longer serve.